Well, we are happy to have here for the first time as a speaker Luis Duarte de Almeida, who is assistant at the Universitat de Lisboa and PhD at the University of Oxford. And among other things, he studied the completeness criteria for legal norms and propositions. And today he will speak about some false problems in the analysis of legal statements. Now it's up to you.
Oh, thank you. That was the title which I announced, some false problems in the analysis of legal statements. But when I announced it, I didn't still have a clear idea of what I wanted to do. And now, not that I now have a clear idea of what I want to do with the whole project, but when I began to work on it, it soon became clear that I would only have time to address one false problem in the analysis of legal statements. So this paper is the first installment of what I hope will be quite a large series. So the title of this paper is Legal Statements and Normative Language. I mean to discuss, well, the problem I mean to discuss is the problem which Joseph Raz called, and I quote, the problem of explaining the use of normative language in describing the law and legal situations. And my paper has 4 sections. In section 1, I will formulate a problem, and I will, in section 2, present Raz's solution for the problem. And these 2 sections will be partly reconstructive and also, I'm afraid, partly exegetical. And I felt these slightly fastidious exercise was needed if the problem was to be discussed in a minimally precise manner. And the discussion proper will be undertaken in sections 3 and 4. In section 3, I will argue that Raz's solution to the problem does not work. And in section 4, I will argue that the problem itself is a false problem. And you might rightly wonder why I take pains to discuss a candidate solution for a problem which I think is false. And I do it mainly, well, not merely for the fun of it, but for 3 reasons. First, my claims in sections 3 and 4 are relatively independent. You may disagree with me that the problem is false, and in that case, I still want to argue that Joseph Raz's solution is not a good one. Secondly, by presenting my argument against Joseph Raz's solution, I will be able to formulate more clearly my claim that the problem is false. And lastly, Joseph Raz's solution has, it seems to me, been generally received without much discussion in contemporary jurisprudence, even if the underlying problem seems to have gone a little bit out of sight. I'm afraid, I'll do my best, which I'm afraid it turned out to be quite a big paper. And I'm not sure I'll be able to, in the presentation proper, to get to section 4. I hope so. I have a handout. So it's this and this.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, it'll get there. So on to the problem. No, creo que no, gracias. Well, it is a fact. I should have distributed that
for a second,
before. Okay.
So we can restart.
It's not.
Okay.
Not enough for you?
Let's go.
It is a fact that we use normative language in describing the law, and as Raz puts it, the law is analyzed and described in terms of duties, obligations, rights and wrongs, etc., he says. So the very same terminology which is used in moral discourse is also employed to describe the law and legal situations. And this fact, Raz submits, is philosophically salient. We need an explanation for the use of normative terms to describe the law and legal situations, and even more so if we observe that an alternative, non-normative vocabulary is also available and also in use, and you have the relevant quotation in the handout. So what we need to explain then is why, this is Raz's formulation, why people use normative language in describing the law. And this question is not only puzzling, it constitutes, in Raz's opinion, one of the main stumbling blocks for legal positivists. How so? Here's a reconstruction of Raz's argument as I see it. Consider the semantic thesis which is marked in the handout as T1. Terms like rights and duties cannot be used with the same meaning in legal and moral contexts. This thesis, Raz says, and bear in mind this is from a 1979 writing, this thesis can be identified as common to most positivist theories. Why should a positivist defend T1, in Raz's opinion? Remember, in sections 1 and 2, I'm trying to reconstruct Raz's view of the problem. Well, a positivist is someone who necessarily holds the so-called sources thesis, which may be formulated as T2, the identification of the law and of the duties and rights it gives rise to is a matter of social fact. The question of its value is a further and separate question, which means that a positivist holds the content and the existence of the law, holds that the content and the existence of the law can be determined by reference to social facts and without relying on moral considerations. And from the conjunction of T2, the social thesis, and the fact which I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that terms like rights and duties are used to describe the law, any law, regardless of its moral merit, T1 seems to follow, says Raz, from the conjunction of the sources thesis and the fact that normative vocabulary is used in stating the law. Why? Because if such terms are used to claim the existence of legal rights and duties, which may, and sometimes do, contradict moral rights and duties, these terms cannot be used in the same meaning in both contexts. We can make the same point in a different manner. Consider a different semantic thesis, P3. Normative terms like a right, a duty, ought, are used in the same sense in legal, moral, and other normative statements. And this thesis, which Raz observes is generally endorsed by natural lawyers, is clearly inconsistent with the first semantic thesis. It's inconsistent with T1, and it appears to imply both T4, legal statements are normative statements in the same sense and in the same way that moral statements are normative. T5, legal statements are full-blooded normative statements, statements about what ought to be done, what rights and duties people have because of the law, and these in turn appear to imply T6. Legal statements are ordinary moral statements. For example, when one states, it is John's legal duty to repay the debt, one is asserting that John has a moral duty to repay the debt arising out of the law. And the positivist needs to reject T6. So if T6 follows from T3, then by modus tollens, the positivist needs to reject T3 and thus needs to endorse T1. So what is the problem that the positivist must face? Well, from Raz's point of view, the problem is quite simply that T3 is true. Raz declares himself convinced by Hart's, I quote, most formidable criticism of reductivist explanations of normative statements, according to which, these reductivist explanations, normative statements are interpretable as, or reducible to, statements, assertions of social facts. And this reductivist stance was, Raz says, that adopted by early positivists such as Bentham and Austin, who claim that legal statements are synonymous with statements about what certain people commanded or willed, or about the chances that a man may come to harm of a certain kind. Now, of course, Hart's own anti-reductivist stance was joined with an expressivist explanation of the deontic or practical character of legal statements as statements used to demand and justify action and used in this manner in legal discourse. But Raz, while siding with Hart in opposing reductivist accounts of legal statements, does not wish to subscribe to Hart's account of the normative dimension, and now I'm quoting from Raz, in terms of the illocutionary and expressive force of legal statements. So Raz's account of legal statements is given instead in terms of reasons. Legal statements are always, or can always be explained in terms of statements of legal reasons for actions. So Raz considers that statements of reasons in general are logically the most elementary stratum of deontic statements, legal or otherwise. He claims that statements of the form legally one ought to five, or of the form it is the law that X ought to five, mean the same as statements of the form there is a legal reason for X to five. And he says that statements of reasons for action cannot be reduced to statements about social facts. So a statement of law, a statement of what legal rights or duties people have, is not a statement about people's beliefs, attitudes, or actions, not even about people's beliefs, attitudes, or actions about the law. So according to Raz, T3 is true, and this would appear to imply that T2, the source's thesis, is false. This is a problem for the positivists. But Raz, just like the positivists in general, wishes at the same time to defend the source's thesis. And so the question becomes whether it is really the case that if T3 is true, positivism is false. So in order to render T2 and T3 compatible, and given that this is assumed in the argument, T2 and T6 are deemed by Raz to be clearly incompatible, what the positivist needs to do is to deny that T6 follows from T3. So he wishes to be able to endorse both T2 and T3, given that T6 is incompatible with T2. He needs to block the move from T3 to T6. So the positivists need to be able to defend that legal statements, and to be sure, to be clear, statements in which normative language is employed in the same sense as in moral context, statements of reasons for action. So I was saying the positive needs to be able to defend that legal statements are grounded on the sources, that is, are grounded on the appropriate social facts. For example, the fact that last year Parliament decreed so. Or in other words, that the existence of the relevant source is the ground for the truth of statements of the form legally X ought to five. And so in short, this is the summary formulation of the problem. What positivists need is an anti-reductivist explanation of legal statements based on the sources. Is this possible? This is the problem. Okay? Is this clear so far? You have the formulation of the problem also in the handout. Now, the problem, Raz says, can be solved, and I'm now beginning section 2. And the solution he offers is presented, at least, as reconstructed from Kelsen's views on legal statements. Why? Well, Kelsen offered, in Raz's assessment, the best positivist explanation for the use of normative language in the law, and developed a most ingenious way of combining the source of thesis with anti-reductivism. Hart's several attempts, in contrast, were less successful, and I think it may be instructive to briefly consider why exactly Raz thinks this was the case. In Raz's assessment, Hart shared the view that admits of only two basic types of normative statements, and these two types are also given in the handout as types 1 and 2. So the first type is that of statements made, statements uttered, to assert what valid reasons for action there are. Statements which express or imply the acceptance on the part of the speaker of the validity of the law concerned. That is, a belief that such law is justified and ought to be followed. And the second type is that of statements about people's beliefs and attitudes to norms. And in Hartian terminology, statements of the first type are said to be internal statements, statements made from the internal point of view, and those of the second type are called external. Now, this is the argument. Surely legal statements, statements of law, cannot be external. They cannot be statements of type 2. External statements are only normative in the sense that normative language is used in them to describe other people's normative views, as in one of Raz's examples, the statement that during the last decade it has become common among professional people to believe that a woman has a right to abortion on demand. So external statements are not normative in the relevant sense, are not statements of reasons for actions. So if the typology of legal statements is to be exhaustive, legal statements must belong to the first kind. They must be Hartian internal statements. But statements of the first kind are statements of what ought to be done, statements of what rights and duties people have because of the law, which imply the speaker's acceptance that the law is justified and ought to be followed. They are full-blooded, ordinary moral statements, and so T6 is true and the social thesis is false. Now, Hart would, to be sure, have denied this conclusion. Hart would have denied that a statement expressing that the speaker accepts that the law is justified and ought to be followed is properly characterized as an ordinary moral statement, because Hart insisted that moral reasons are only one type of reasons for accepting rules and for having the kind of practical attitude which was manifested in internal statements. And so he would have maintained that ordinary legal discourse does not commit one to moral approbation of the law. But Raz believes that Hart cannot consistently hold this position, and that he would be forced to concede that most internal statements, and at any rate statements about rights and duties of others, not statements about your own rights and duties, are really moral claims. I will skip Raz's argument, it's not relevant for my present concerns. What matters is that it enables Raz to formulate the following dilemma. For Hart and for any other theorist who maintains that there can only be these two basic types of legal statements. Given that clearly many legal statements do not express a moral position either way about the law, not all legal statements are internal, Hartian internal statements. But those legal statements which are not internal cannot, as we saw, also be external. So what can they be? Hart, says Raz, has no alternative account, and he has no alternative account precisely because he admits of only these two basic types identified. And this is meant simultaneously to establish an intermediate conclusion, which is that no anti-reductivist explanation of legal statements, which is at the same time based on the source's thesis, is possible under this typological assumption that there can only be these two types, and to suggest the way out. The solution for the problem seems to require the possibility of a normative, and therefore not external, a normative statement which, although made by the use of our ordinary normative terms, does not carry the same normative force of an ordinary moral statement. Are these statements possible? Well, quite possible, Raz says, as is well known. Not only quite possible, but also quite frequent. And this third species, Raz says, was already, if unclearly noticed by Carlson. He chooses to name them, everyone knows this, detached legal statements, and contrasts them with statements of type 1, which are called committed. And this, says Raz, provides a framework for a solution to the dilemma by explaining a class of statements which are normally made by the use of normative language, which are not about behaviors or beliefs, but about rights and duties, and which are nonetheless not committed and not internal legal statements. And detached legal statements, in Raz's view, are in fact just a species of the most general and also quite frequent kind of detached normative statements, legal or otherwise. Detached statements, he says, are widespread in legal contexts, yes, but also widely used outside the law in all spheres of practical reason, including morality. And detached statements are, always according to Raz, of great importance to our understanding of discourse about the law, as well as normative discourse in other contexts. So it may be useful to examine the general notion before attending to the particularities of legal detached statements. So generally speaking, a detached statement, and I quote, is to be found whenever a person advises or informs another of his normative situation in contexts which make it clear that the advice is given from a point of view or on the basis of certain assumptions which are not necessarily shared by the speaker. So detached statements are normative statements made from a point of view. I will discuss two well-known examples of Raz's which are given in the handout, and I call them the vegetarian example and the orthodox Jew example. It's worth going through them. If I go with my vegetarian friend to a dinner party, I may say to him, you should not eat this dish, it contains meat. Not being a vegetarian, I do not believe that the fact that that dish contains meat is a reason against eating it. I do not therefore believe that my friend has reason to refrain from eating it, nor am I stating that he has. I'm merely informing him what ought to be done from the point of view of a vegetarian. Of course, the very same sentence can be used by a fellow vegetarian to state what ought to be done, but this is not what I'm saying, as my friend who understands the situation will know. Similar example, imagine an orthodox but relatively ill-informed Jew who asks the advice of his friend, who is a Catholic, but an expert in rabbinical law. What should I do? He asks. Clearly meaning, what should I do according to my religion, not yours? The friend tells him that he should do so and so. The point is that both know that this is not what the friend thinks he, the Orthodox Jew, really ought to do. The friend is simply stating how things are from the Jewish Orthodox point of view. The distinctive features of detached statements may be nicely brought out, I think, if we pay attention to a syntactical ambiguity in the vegetarian example. In the sentence, this is the fourth line, I am merely informing him what ought to be done from the point of view of a vegetarian. There are two possible readings of this sentence. On the first reading, it denotes that I make a statement informing the hearer, the vegetarian, of what ought to be done. And moreover mentions, this sentence in the example mentions that the statement was made from the point of view of a vegetarian. So, in the text, under this reading, the phrase from the point of view of the vegetarian refers to the statement made. On the second possible reading, the sentence, I'm informing him what ought to be done from the point of view of a vegetarian, the sentence refers to a statement of what ought to be done from the point of view of a vegetarian. So under this reading, the phrase from the point of view of a vegetarian is part of the statement made, and the statement therefore amounts to a conditional statement informing the hearer of what to be done if he, the hearer, the vegetarian, accepts the point of view of the vegetarian. And clearly, not from the example, but from several passages, it's the first reading which is the correct one. Raz insists, I quote, that detached statements are not to be understood as conditionals of the form, if you accept this point of view, you should fight, but rather as statements made from a point of view as if the point of view is valid, or on the hypothesis that the point of view is valid, but without actually endorsing it. Detached statements, still quoting, are like statements made on the assumption that something is the case. For example, like a statement made on the assumption that a certain scientific theory is valid. And these statements made on the assumption that X, these are not conditionals of which the assumption is the antecedent, nor do they presuppose that the content of the assumption is true. Rather, they state what is the case from the point of view of the theory, for example, or on the assumption of the theory. Now, some critics, Boligin most notably, have denied that detached statements can really be distinguished from conditional statements of the form, if you accept, and Giovanni, for your expression, if you accept this point of view, then you should fight. But although I do have a problem with detached statements, this is not my problem. I believe that the difference can be made, and it can be made clearly if we keep in mind that detached statements may be either preceded or followed by the phrase speaking from the point of view of, without any change of meaning. And so we may make salient the difference between, you have the formulation in the handout, in the second page, between one, the conditional, the statement one, if you accept the point of view of a vegetarian, you ought to fight, and either to A or to B, you ought to fight. And I'm speaking from a vegetarian's point of view. Or, speaking from a vegetarian's point of view, you ought to fight. This makes the difference between the conditional statement in one and the detached statement in 2A and 2B clear. In other words, the adoption of the point of view, Giovanni.
So 2B is the same as one. If you speak from a vegetarian point of view.
No, but the point is this. Let me phrase it differently. I hope it's clear that what I give as 1 to A and to B, the formulations given, are the statement made. So in 1, what the speaker utters is, if you accept the point of view of a vegetarian, you ought to fight. And in 2A, what the speaker utters is, you ought to fight, speaking from, and I am speaking from the point of view of a vegetarian. So these are the formulations of the statements themselves. The point is, in 2A or 2B, the adoption of a point of view ranges only over the statement that you ought to fight. While the utterance of one can be made from no particular point of view at all. I don't need to adopt any point of view to say that, well, if you adopt a point of view of a vegetarian, you ought to fight. But I need to adopt the point of view of a vegetarian in order to make a statement from that point of view that you ought not to eat meat, for example. Now, this said, and just for the sake of completeness, some very minor points, the vegetarian and the non-vegetarian statements may be linguistically identical. They both may utter a sentence of the form, you ought to fight. Whereas this point is that the sentences will, the utterances will vary in meaning, understanding meaning in a broad sense. It's what he says in the end of the example, that they are saying different things, and the hearer will discern whether the statement is a detached statement or a committed statement. And I quote, on the basis of the speaker's intentions, as revealed by their utterances or by the contexts in which the utterances are made. And so, to be clear, and in spite of what these particular examples may suggest, the difference between the detached and the committed statement does not hinge on whether the speaker himself actually believes in or accepts a point of view adopted, but rather on whether such an acceptance is expressed or implied by the statement. So a committed statement is a statement which expresses or implies the speaker's acceptance of the point of view adopted, whether or not the speaker in fact, adopts that point of view. So a committed statement may be insincere. And detached statements do not express such an acceptance, even if the speaker may himself personally adopt it. Raz makes very clear that you may, being a vegetarian, utter a detached statement made from the point of view of a vegetarian. You simply do not convey, do not express by the making of the statement that you yourself adopt the point of view. And legal statements, too, can be made from a point of view, says Raz. And namely, they can be made by a speaker who merely adopts, without endorsing, without accepting, what he indistinctly calls the point of view of the legal man, or the legal point of view, or the point of view of the law-abiding citizen. And this point of view is variously described in different texts. You have several formulations in the handout. In short, it is the point of view of someone who accepts that the law is valid in a special sense of validity, which means that the law is justified and ought to be obeyed. And one of Raz's legal examples is that of a statement that A ought to pay 80 pounds income tax, made as a legal statement. And this, sentences like this, or utterances of tokens of this, may be used to state what reasons for actions people have, and this is the committed use, but they may also be used not to state what reasons for actions A, not what action A has reason to perform, but simply to state what his legal situation is by a speaker, assuming, without accepting, the point of view of the legal man, the point of view of the law-abiding citizen. And detached legal statements, as I said, are extremely common, according to Raz. They are typical, I quote, typical legal science, which describes the law and normative statements from a point of view which is not necessarily accepted by a speaker. Likewise, when giving legal advice, a solicitor or any other person is stating what is the case from the legal point of view, and a law lecturer or legal writer normally does the same. And a barrister arguing a case before a court may do no more. So it seems even educated, please do it, I would say. It's rather frequent in Raz's view. So if Raz is right, the problem seems to have been solved. Because a detached statement is neither an external statement nor an ordinary moral statement. It is a statement of law. Joanne. It's neither an external statement nor an ordinary moral statement. It is a statement of law, so it is a statement of what legal rights or duties people have, and so not a statement about people's beliefs about what rights and duties they have. It's not an external statement, but which means it's normative. It's a normative statement in the relevant sense. But detached statements are not full-blooded normative statements, because given that the utterance does not commit the speaker to the normative view expressed by the statement, a detached statement does not carry the full force of an ordinary normative statement. So it seems we simply have to reject the assumption that types 1 and 2 are the only kinds of normative statements, and just welcome detached legal statements in our typology as a further kind, and I quote, not reducible to the other two. Problem solved, it appears. Now, as I said in the beginning, I don't think the solution works, and so let me formulate my objection, and I'm now beginning section 3. How long do I have?
15 minutes.
Okay. There are two features of detached statements, which, although Raz never spells them as such, have to be assumed, I submit, if the notion is to be of any use. First, detached statements are meant to be informative. That is, by uttering a detached statement, the speaker must be able to convey some information which was previously unavailable to the hearer. And this is made very clear both in the vegetarian and in the Orthodox Jew example. The non-vegetarian Raz writes, is informing his friend of what ought to be done from the point of view of a vegetarian. And likewise, the reason the Orthodox Jew asks the advice of his Catholic friend is that precisely he seeks some information. What Raz says, he's relatively ill-informed. So the text statements are clearly meant to be informative. The second feature, I'm not quite sure how precisely to characterize it, but I hope my idea is sufficiently clear. The second feature concerns a kind of relation which must necessarily obtain between, on the one hand, the content of the point of view adopted in the making of the text statement, that is the content of the assumption on which the statement is made, and on the other hand, the content of the statement itself. And I say this because the very idea of a statement made from a point of view seems to import that the evaluation of whether the statement is true or false, the evaluation of whether the statement is true or false, is itself relative to the point of view adopted in the making of the statement. So it seems to import that it may be the case that from point of view P1, a token of statement S may be assessed as true, while a token of the same statement S, if uttered from point of view P2, might be assessed as false. This seems to be implied in the very notion of a statement made from a point of view. Now, you may recall that Raz says that statements made from a point of view are like statements made on the assumption that something is the case. And when a statement is made on the assumption that A, the content of the assumption, is taken as true. This is what it means to make a statement on the assumption that A. So even if it is false, even if the speaker and the hearer know that it is false, when I make a statement on the assumption that I take the content of the assumption as true. And this has, I believe, the following pragmatic consequence. The point of uttering a statement on a given assumption must be that what is being stated is to be assessed relatively to the assumption, and so that a statement which might otherwise be false may, on the assumption that A, be assessed as true. So, maybe with an example I would be clearer. It would be just as pragmatically pointless to make a statement on the assumption that P, when whether or not P is the case, is absolutely irrelevant for the truth of the statement made. It would be pointless, for example, to say, today is Wednesday, on the assumption that a daily glass of red wine a day is good for your health. The assumption has nothing to do. Whether or not the assumption is true, in that case it's clearly true, but whether or not it's true is irrelevant for the assessment of the statement that today is Wednesday. And by the same token, it would equally be pointless to make a statement on the assumption that P, when P itself exhausts the content of the statement made. So it would be pointless for me to say, well, on the assumption that today is Wednesday. This would be, in some sense, redundant and therefore pragmatically pointless. And as redundant, it would also be uninformative and so violate the first requisite I pointed. So, in order for a statement made on an assumption not to be pointless in this sense, it needs to be the case that the content of the assumption is part, but only part and not all, of what makes it the case that the statement is true. And so that in order sincerely to utter the statement, the adoption of the point of view is in this sense required. And it's necessary for the speaker to adopt a point of view to make some sort of statement. And this seems to be assumed by Raz. His claim appears to be that the utterance of a non-committed normative statement, demands that the speaker adopts the relevant point of view, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to make a normative statement. So normative statements are either, this is Raz's point, are either committed or made from a point of view. No other option is available. And with this in mind, was I sufficiently or minimally clear? Yes? No? Some reaction, please?
For me, it's totally
Obscure. I'll deal with you in the discussion, but from the very beginning.
It's Raz's fault.
Maybe this is, well, Raz very funnily says that Kelsen is very obscure. So Raz's reconstruction of Kelsen is a case of second order obscurity. Maybe my discussion of Raz is a case of third order obscurity. Okay. But with this in mind, let me...
That's the definition of the content of the point of view, because it seems to be, it's beyond my capacity to understand.
Is it... Okay.
Definition of the
I got a question, Giovanni. Is the notion of a statement made on an assumption beyond your capacities? I may say, well, on the assumption, I was speaking mainly of assumptions. Because Raz does not make a clear distinction between his notion of a point of view, which seems to be a metaphor, and the notion of an assumption. So, if you don't have that kind of problem with an assumption, the content of an assumption is a proposition. On the assumption that X, that's the content of an assumption. Proposition may be true or false.
definition of assumption in your scheme?
I began by saying, well, I don't have yet a fully precise, but I hope, I trust, it's minimally clear to everybody what an assumption amounts to. No?
Presupposition in a logical sense?
No, it's not. It's neither a semantic nor a pragmatic presupposition.
Nor
So-
pragmatic. Maybe pragmatic.
Maybe pragmatic. It's not. It's not. It's clearly not a semantic presupposition because the content of the assumption does not have to be true in order for the statement to be either true or false, assessed of either true or false. So it's not semantic presupposition. Maybe it ought to be qualified as a pragmatic presupposition. Maybe. But what I intend to make clear is that there must be some relation between the content of the assumption, whatever the best philosophical characterization or account of the notion of an assumption is, and the content of the statement made under the assumption. Of course, it's not nonsense to say, well, under the assumption that red wine is good for you, today is Wednesday. This is not nonsense. That's what, I'm not making a semantic point whether this statement is meaningful or not. It is meaningful. I'm making a pragmatic point. Why would I, in order to say that today is Wednesday, why would I make it under the assumption that red wine is good for you? This is the aspect I'm trying to capture. So let me get back to Raz's non-legal examples, and I'll begin with the orthodox Jew example, in which the hearer himself is an Orthodox Jew. I will stipulate that an Orthodox Jew is someone who accepts that the laws of the Torah are justified and ought to be obeyed. I'm not sure how precise this definition is stipulated. Now, when I say this, an Orthodox Jew is someone who accepts that the laws of the Torah are binding. I use the phrase the laws of the Torah. This phrase is to be understood not extensionally, but intentionally. So an Orthodox Jew may identify himself as someone who accepts as binding the laws of the Torah, and at the same time not have a complete knowledge of all the laws of the Torah. Okay? Which seems in fact to be the case in the example. Now, in this example, since the Catholic friend's statement is meant to be informative, it needs to impart to the hearer some information which the hearer would not already have possessed simply in virtue of being an Orthodox Jew. So consider, for example, the statement which I give in the handout as 1. You ought to behave as the Torah requires. This is a statement that a Catholic cannot sincerely make as a committed statement. So in order to utter one, the Catholic has to adopt the Orthodox Jew point of view. Well, you see what I mean, Giovanni. So in order to utter this, of course, my second requisite is fulfilled, there would be a point to the adoption of the Orthodox point of view, because the Catholic would not be able to utter one otherwise. But this statement, in this example, would be completely non-informative for the Jew. The Jew already knows that, or believes or accepts that. The Catholic does not convey anything informative by saying that. And one, moreover, seems also to be redundant, because given the definition of an Orthodox Jew, one can be rendered as one R. R is for redundancy. Speaking from the point of view of someone who believes that you ought to behave as the Torah requires, you ought to behave as the Torah requires. So one is clearly not the information required by the Orthodox Jew in the example.
Still 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. The question, the Orthodox Jew's question to his friend, is rather about the content of the Torah, about whether the Torah, for example, requires from him a particular action on a particular occasion. So what he expects as an answer to his question seems to be something with the form "to." The Torah requires you to find. Now, clearly an information of this type, "to," does not simply follow from the fact that one is an Orthodox Jew. But in that case, and precisely because of that, it appears that no particular point of view is required from the Catholic in order to utter "to." No particular point of view is needed in order to make an utterance of "to." And the very same happens in the vegetarian example. So, what is the informative content of the speaker's statement? And the case is quite ambiguous in this respect. And at first sight, it would perhaps seem that which the vegetarian does not know, that which the non-vegetarian friend tells him, is that the dish contains meat. That's at least my impression on a first reading. But this cannot be what Raz means, because that the dish contains meat is a straightforward statement of fact, not a normative statement. So the alternative interpretation is that the friend, the vegetarian friend, in spite of being a vegetarian, does not know that vegetarianism requires one not to eat meat. And this makes the example highly implausible, but this is the reading which is needed if the example is to be a case similar to the Orthodox Jew one. But let's take that reading. In this case, once again, the statement can only be informative if the content of the statement does not simply follow from the very fact that one is a vegetarian. And so the statement cannot be a statement that, for example, you ought to follow the laws of vegetarianism. The friend already knows that. The statement must be that vegetarian laws require that you do not eat meat, and this may be informative, but no point of view seems to be required. No special. You don't need to adopt a vegetarian point of view any more than you need to adopt any other possible point of view. So this is the short formulation of my objection. Detached statements are either pointless or non-informative. Even within this part 3, I have 3 counter objections to my objection, which I'll try to discuss, but maybe they'll come up in discussion. So just to summarize, I'll try to dismiss 3 possible counter objections, some, at least one of which I find implausible, but someone might be tempted to do it. And my conclusion is that detached statements, detached normative statements, just the notion is unworkable. And it follows that they cannot be frequent in everyday context, because the very notion is unworkable. In 4, I try to argue that the problem itself is false, and the gist of the claim is that Raz wrongly infers from the fact, which is a fact, the fact I said in the beginning, it is a fact, that we use normative terminology in making legal statements, that legal statements are normative, are statements of reasons for actions, that they cannot simply be, well, Bullinger will probably say external, but this inference is required for the very problem to be formulated, and it's unwarranted. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.